我靠，把猪拉上来了！你什么时候能把神君怎么拉上来呀？
Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video. Today, we'll be finally discussing Topaz team compositions, and this has been a pretty hot topic in both the CN community and the English community. So far, the consensus on Topaz is that she's not dealing as much damage because she doesn't perform as a main DPS, or the current Followup Attacker units are just not up to par. We'll be discussing all of these, but rest assured that Topaz can definitely fully clear the endgame content with no issues whatsoever, right? And before we actually begin, I just do want to take this opportunity to just apologize to my viewers, because from the time when I made the Topaz guide, there are some critical mistakes that I made during this guide, because that's what 36 hours of no sleep does to you. But just a very quick amendment for two things. The first of all being her light cone, and the second of all being her Eidolon 2. Her light cone tame, it affects all sources of damage, but it is applied by the wearer's follow-up attack only. But once this is applied, this is a 24% crit damage buff provided to your entire team, right? Any sources of damage can benefit from this 24% crit damage buff, which is essentially almost like a full Xuan's Eidolon 1. So it's actually really good. Not to mention, this tame, it can be used to mark multiple targets. Maybe in the future, if we get like an AoE hunt unit, then this light cone is gonna have a lot of values. So as you guys can see from the chart over here, the S1 value actually outweighs the Eidolon 1 value, especially for general team compositions, because this is basically a 24% crit damage buff to all sources of attack. Now, how much is a 24% crit damage buff equivalent to? So as you can see here, at the start at 70% crit rate at 120% crit damage all the way to 270% crit damage, the benefits slowly start to taper off due to diminishing returns. So it will benefit the character the most when it has around 120%, which is basically the lesser crit damage you have, the more the benefits you get, right? So it will be a 9% raw damage output increase compared to a 5.8% raw damage output increase. The ranking is still unchanged. Her signature light cone is still the strongest, followed by Herta's S5. The signature light cone is just a lot better compared to the Herta light cone. Also, another thing that I want to note here, that in the night light cone from Silly, it's actually really bad on Topaz, because all of the buffs are unable to affect Numbi. You can see that from in the night light cone effect, none of it buffs your follow-up attack, but the ranking is still exactly the same. Now, another thing to take note is that her Eidolon 2, the phrasing Numbi takes action, this Eidolon 2 includes Topaz skill, because Topaz skill is where she throws Numbi forward and she does like a little spin, right? This is actually able to benefit from this Eidolon 2. This guarantees a 3-turn ultimate without using ER rope, right? So this cements my previous statement, which is her Eidolon 2 is really good. So I had nothing changed about that, but I just want to bring this to attention that her Eidolon 2 is not only just for Numbi's follow-up attack, it's including her skill as well, right? So those are the two key amendments, not to mention the very first 10 seconds, her only 5-star hunt. I'm sorry guys, I just didn't have enough sleep. So that's for the amendments, and without further ado, let's jump into today's content, which is her team compositions. Now, before we talk about the actual teammates, I just want to let you guys know there will be a different criteria for both main DPS Topaz as well as sub DPS Topaz. So players can definitely experiment with this themselves, right? And as usual, viable is not the same as optimal. I'm always a firm believer in this. For sustain, I didn't list them because honestly, any sustain works with Topaz. Fu Xuan though, she'll see exceptional value in a sub DPS comp with Topaz and another DPS, since they all benefit from the crit rate buff from Fu Xuan, right? So Fu Xuan is exceptionally good, but every other sustain unit, you can honestly just run them and it should be a-okay. Now let's talk about the team building basics for Topaz. Topaz damage output, majority of it comes from Numbi, which is something like how Jingyuan's damage output, majority of it came from Lightning Knot. And without sufficient ultimate uptime, then Numbi's damage falls off drastically. Essentially, she does around like half the damage it would have done with the ultimate buff. So that's something to keep in mind. Secondly, Topaz prefers attack percentage buffs to damage percentage buffs. Now, I've mentioned this in my Topaz guide previously, but this is going to be crucial for us when it comes to which are the supports supports we want to pair up with Topaz. We will be running speed boots and possibly even ER rope on Topaz, which means that Topaz attack will be less than 2000. So having an attack percentage buff will be really good for Topaz. Next, Topaz follow-up attack comp. Now this composition is currently quite limited. For us, follow-up composition is even more limited than DOT because we have some very good excellent 4-star DOT units, right? Sampo, Luca, and now we have Gui Laifen. So all these units are really good in DOT. But for follow-up attackers, we really just don't have a very big pool of units because despite us having a lot of units with follow-up attacks, it doesn't necessarily mean that they synchronize well with Topaz because not only do they need to deal damage with their follow-up attacks, they also need to have high frequency, right? Without high frequency, then Numbi's action value is just not going to be fully utilized, even though you have very high damage. So that's something to keep in mind. And lastly, Topaz main DPS and Topaz sub DPS setup, as well as the supports, is going to be very different. And that's basically it for her team building basics. Now moving on to the support units, essentially Topaz can just be ran with all of these support units. All our 6 Harmony Girls, Yukong, Tingyun, Bronya, Asta, Silverwolf, and Pela, they are all viable with Topaz. But I'll be noting some of the few exceptional ones that work really well with Topaz, starting off with Asta. Now, Asta is extremely suitable for Topaz due to the attack percentage buff and speed buff, both of which are highly synergistic with Topaz kit, right? Because Topaz wants speed so that she can go faster, and it allows her to buff up Numbi's action value by having more turns, and Topaz can now generate energy much quicker, right? And therefore leads to a higher ultimate uptime. And then for attack percentage, like I mentioned just now, she needs attack percentage a lot more than damage percentage. So with Asta, we can now maintain a pretty high attack even with ER rope and speed boots, possibly even hitting 200 speed after Asta's speed buff to increase our ultimate uptime even further, right? Not to mention, Asta also has an 18% fire damage buff, as well as the ability to use Planetary Rendezvous Light Cone. So in a dual DPS setup with Himeko, Asta's value is second to none. So she is going to be the best in slot support for sub DPS Topaz in a mono fire team composition, and I'll be talking a little bit more about Himeko later on. Now moving on to Bronya, first of all, Numbi cannot gain any benefits from Bronya's skill buff, even without factoring this, even without this damage percentage buff, or even without Bronya's ultimate with the attack percentage and crit damage buff, which are both really good. Bronya's extra action alone using a skill easily places her at the highest DPS increase amongst any support, because I've mentioned this in my previous Jingliu team composition. She essentially doubles your DPS action, right? She basically allows your DPS to go twice. So the only limiting factor is if your team ran out of skill points, then Bronya's skill uptime will be impacted, right? But other than that, she will always be one of, if not the best single support for any hyper carry or any main DPS. So that's something to keep in note. Next, 134 Bronya, it out damages 160 Bronya, right? I think by now this is just applied to every single unit, because 134 Bronya, it essentially allows you to cast a skill every single turn. Whereas for 160 plus Bronya, you have to alternate between your skill and your basic attack. And with this point, the only limiting criteria, like I mentioned just now, is the skill points, right? And Topaz is not as skill point heavy as other hyper carries, since Topaz's basic attack also has the benefits, right? It can trigger Numbi's action value advance, since it counts as a follow-up. Not to mention, if you guys have Topaz signature Light Cone, it also counts as a follow-up for Tame Proc. So Topaz can use basic attack all she wants, and then Bronya can just keep on using her skill and using her skill to buff up Topaz damage. So at the end of the day, Bronya is going to be the best in slot for a main DPS Topaz, and Asta is the best in slot for sub DPS Topaz. Now moving on to another Harmony unit which everybody's familiar with, Tingyun. As usual, anybody that can buff Topaz attack percentage is always going to be useful, since especially if you're going to compare this with Bronya, right? Bronya's attack percentage buff is only available during her ultimate. So Tingyun as well as Asta, these characters with very common attack percentage buffs will definitely benefit Topaz. Another thing is that her energy provided allows for an almost permanent Numbi ultimate buff uptime, which leads to an incredible DPS increase, even more so if our Topaz E2 is unlocked. So with this combination, your Nambi is perpetually always in the enhanced state, dealing tremendous damage. So it's really good for a hyper carry main DPS Topaz setup. But it might be a little bit of an issue, and this issue is also shared with Bronya, is that both Bronya and Tingyun, they can only buff a single unit. So when it comes to like a dual DPS setup, then they're not going to be as beneficial compared to Asta, unless you're okay with just completely neglecting one of the carries, right? Next, Tingyun's low skill point consumption also allows for Topaz to use more skills, which results in even faster ultimate. And since Tingyun is the best Dance user out of any Harmony support, Tingyun can cast her ultimate on the very first turn. So because of this, we can easily zero cycle the first wave, coupled with Topaz innate high speed, as well as the skill point generated for our entire team, right? So this is an excellent alternative for players without Bronya in a main DPS setup. And if players have Bronya, feel free to use both Bronya and Tingyun together for just incredible synergy, right? Tingyun is there to give you attack percentage and damage percentage and energy. Then Bronya is there to give you even more extra turns, more attack percentage, crit damage, and damage percentage, right? So they are really synergistic with one another. And for our final Harmony support is going to be Yukong. She has the same point with Tingyun as well as Asta. Attack percentage buffs is always going to be useful to Topaz, but the downside for Yukong is that she is going to be a bit more skill point intensive, because Asta's attack percentage buff is pretty much always up, especially if you have E6, and Tingyun's attack percentage buff, you only need to cast the skill points once every 3 turns, right? So that's something for players to consider. But due to Topaz's lower skill point consumption, like I mentioned, same point for Bronya just now, Yukong can actually use a skills more frequently to ensure that we cast her ultimate every 3 turns. Do note that casting Yukong's ultimate every 3 turns is not enough. We also need to time it with Topaz ultimate being casted every 3 turns, right? You want to synchronize Yukong's crit rate, crit damage, and attack buff after using Topaz ultimate. So if players are able to time this, the attack percentage and double crit buff makes Yukong the best nuke support for a single hit. For that single damage per screenshot, Nambi is going to do a ridiculous amount of damage once you time everything together. However, this is only for a single hit, and in the long drawn out fights, especially if players are unable to clear the Memory of Chaos within like 3 to 4 turns, 3 to 4 cycles, then Yukong may face more skill point issues down the line, and using supports like Tingyun, Bronya, or Asta would provide you with a better ease of playing, right? And another point, especially relevant to the free-to-plays, is that she'll require heavy speed tuning if you do not have her Eidolon 6, and this will definitely affect the free-to-plays or low spenders' comfort when you're trying to use Yukong, right? And if players have an Eidolon 4 Topaz, then speed tuning is pretty much impossible because of the 20% action value advance every single time after Nambi takes an action. So that's going to be an issue. Not as comfortable, not as easy to use compared to the previous 3 Harmony units, but an excellent nuke potential for some juicy, massive damage with Nambi, especially so if you have Yukong at Eidolon 6. Now moving on to our 2 debuffers, Silverwolf and Pela. Overall, Silverwolf outperforms Pela due to Topaz being single target. So Pela's AoE is not going to be as efficient. The speed debuff, defense, attack, res, it benefits any DPS, not just Topaz, and even more so for an extremely high amount of debuffs concentrated on a single target, which allows hunt units like Sile as well as Topaz to just do ridiculous amounts of damage, right? Since everything is concentrated into one. Unlike previous destruction units like Jingliu, Inhibitor Lune, where AoE debuffs will benefit them even more. Not to mention, Silverwolf's weakness implant also allows for more elemental coverage, and this is something that no other supports can do. So Silverwolf with Topaz plus throwing an Asta and either a Fu Xuan or even Fire MC is going to be a really good team compositions for you to tackle most if not all content in the game, right? But due to Topaz as well as Silverwolf's kit, we may face issues against multiple mobs, right? Because Topaz is not really great at killing mobs, because if you want to kill mobs with Topaz, you're going to over damage the mob by quite a bit, because there is no resurgence, there's no AoE whatsoever. So not to mention, now with Silverwolf, we do need to apply our debuffs one by one, so players may face some issues when we have a lot of different mobs, right? But that aside, Silverwolf also has the highest personal damage of all supports via the break effect build or the crit rate build, and she will be the best in slot for elemental coverage. Then Pela, generally she's just not as synergistic as all of the other supports that I've mentioned, but MOC10 actually favors Pela by quite a bit because of her Dispel ability. None other supports we have the Dispel ability, and having Pela's Dispel will greatly improve our experience playing MOC 10 with Topaz currently because of those two Mara-stricken revive soldiers, right? You really want to get rid of them as soon as possible, and Pela's Dispel will help Topaz tremendously when it comes to defending it as soon as possible. But in the future stages, in the future MOC 10 or any MOC stages for a matter of fact, without this Dispel being as necessary, then Pela wouldn't have as much value compared to the previous supports. Also, Pela's skill point positivity is also not super important for Topaz compared to the other main DPS, because although it's useful where Topaz can just cast out skill every single time and have a higher ultimate uptime, but other DPS units like Imbibitor Lune, Jingliu, Silei, or even Jingyuan, they will benefit from this skill point positivity much more, to the point where you will almost never use their basic attacks, right? But Topaz, she can still cycle between basic attack and skill, right? And then her AoE defense down, like I mentioned just now, it only benefits the target that Topaz and Nambi is attacking, and all of the other targets with the defense down is essentially wasted because we can't hit multiple targets, right? So generally speaking, this is not just applied for Pela, but Topaz needs more buffs than debuffs due to Topaz's demand for speed and energy, right? She generally is just somebody that lacks enough stats to compete with all the other previous DPS, right? Jingliu has a ton of attack buff herself. In Lune, likewise, incredible multipliers. So generally speaking, Topaz really wants the buffs from our Harmony units so that she can stack on energy and speed, which is something that you can't really buff that straightforwardly, right? So that is that for Topaz support units. Now moving on to the next portion, which is the common follow-up attackers for Topaz. There are basically 4 key units that I'll be discussing today: Clara, Jingyuan, Himeko, and Kafka. Now, all other units in Honkai Star with follow-up attacks, right? Yanqing, Qingque, Herta, etc. Not saying that they are not good, but it's just that compared to these units, follow-up attacks are not the core component of their kit, right? They are not super reliant on follow-up attack. In fact, it's just it's basically like a sprinkle on the cake for all these other units. They either suffer an issue from a lack of frequency or a lack of damage, and therefore they will not be as viable or as optimal as these 4 units I've listed over here, right? So that's gonna be that. And without further ado, let's just jump to our current best in slot, which is going to be Clara. Now, Clara has the highest synergy with Topaz due to her having the fastest follow-up attack frequency, on top of dealing impressive amounts of damage after casting her ultimate with the enhanced follow-up attack, right? And she's essentially skill point neutral or even positive, which allows our Topaz to use our skill much more frequently for a higher Nambi ultimate uptime, which is then easily triggered once again by Clara's frequent follow-up attack. So these two really synergize very well. Another good thing for Clara is that she's also our tankiest DPS, which reduces the pressure for our sustained units to use our skill points and heal our DPS compared to, like, for example, Jingyuan or Kafka or Himeko, because generally they are more squishy, right? So this allows us to allocate even more skill points, not just for Topaz, not just for Clara, but also our supports such as Asta or Tingyun. We're going to be using them, right? One issue Clara may have is that if the marked target does not hit Clara, because proof of that only applies to a single target, and if Clara doesn't hit a target afflicted with proof of that, then there is just basically no benefits whatsoever. So players can mitigate this either through pure RNG or having higher uptime on Clara's ultimate, which gives her increased taunt value, as well as giving her next few enhanced attacks AoE follow-up attacks, right? Perhaps you could see an energy regeneration rogue Clara in the future, but that's going to be a topic for another video. But currently, Clara is going to be our best in slot follow-up attacker, and as you can see from the calculations over here, from a 2-man calculation, within 4 cycles they can output around 529,000 damage. But I'll be talking a little bit about the DPS simulations later on, but TLDR, take this with a grain of salt. Now moving on to Jingyuan. Jingyuan's Lightning Lord is the strongest single follow-up attack in the entire game, with massive benefits from proof of that, because at level 10 proof of that, this is a 50% damage increase, right? So Jingyuan's Lightning Lord is going to definitely benefit from this by a very large margin. Also, both of his skills and ultimates, they are damaging abilities, which can be used to increase Nambi's action value if we are casting it during Topaz ultimate, right? Not to mention, Jingyuan having AoE means that we can easily clear out the random mobs and just focus on the boss very quickly due to the team-wide damaging abilities. But that being said, the biggest issue with Jingyuan is really just Lightning Lord's slow speed. And Lightning Lord's slow speed essentially means that our Nambi's action value increase is not gonna have a very high uptime, because Lightning Lord happens very infrequently as compared to, for example, Clara or even Himeko, right? Jingyuan's damage output, if you guys have seen my previous video, 40% of his damage output actually still comes from his skill and ultimate, especially important important for mob killing, and this will not benefit whatsoever from Proof of That, right? Because Proof of That only buffs up Followup attack damage by 50%. So there's going to be minimal benefits when it comes to his skill and ultimate for both Proof of That as well as Nambi's action value increase. Comparing this with Clara, you can see over here, it is a roughly 10% DPS drop off in a 2-man simulation. And at the end of the day, Jingyuan just ultimately performs much better as a hyper carry with Tingyun and Bronya buffing him up, giving him energy, giving him damage, as well as Asta providing him with the speed, right? So that is going to be that for Jingyuan. And now moving on to Himeko. Himeko is extremely powerful, but only in a mono fire setup due to her synergies with Asta, Topaz, Planetary Rendezvous, as well as Fire's high break efficiency. The flip side is that Himeko is just really good only when we are limited to enemies weak to fire. Otherwise, other team compositions will out damage even if Himeko could break, right? So even if Himeko could break the target when she's just being there to thrown as like a breaker, if the enemies are not weak to fire, then a lot of the benefits you see here are going to go to waste. So what are some of the benefits? The fire damage buff from Asta, the fire damage buff from Topaz, and as well as Fire just having very high break efficiency. So if the enemy does not have fire weakness, then it's just completely irrelevant. So generally speaking, players will only want to run Himeko in this mono fire setup, and currently it's performing really well in our MOC 10 phase 1. It's just really good. One key note for any Himeko and Topaz enjoyers is that players need to learn how to stack the breaks between the mobs and the elites, because we cannot stack all of our breaks at the same time, right? So for example, if you break 2 mobs and 2 elites all at the same time, Himeko will only launch a follow-up attack a single time. So learning how to time to split up your follow-up attacks, right? First you break 3 mobs and then you get 1 follow-up, and then you break 1 elite and then you get 1 follow-up, and then you break another elite and then you get another follow-up. So just cycle between these follow-up attacks for a much better playing experience. And lastly, Himeko and Topaz, they are both highly reliant on Asta, because both of these units, they really want speed in their kit, and Himeko is just generally a pretty slow unit. So Himeko, Topaz, your support is basically limited to Asta. In fact, for most of these follow-up attack compositions, Asta is looking to be the best in slot support, like I mentioned just now, and no other supports really just come close. But this is not really an issue for players since, you know, Asta is given to us for free, right? So the bottom line is that Himeko and Topaz is a great pick for mono fire team against enemies that are weak to fire, but other than that, then her performance is pretty mediocre. And now we have come to our final unit, which is actually a surprisingly Kafka. This Kafka build, it has been discussed quite largely in the CN community on how valuable it is, but the consensus is this: a high speed crit Kafka has really decent synergy with Topaz, because for Kafka, she's guaranteed to land her follow-up attack on the right target every single time, unlike Clara, while also having a much higher frequency for follow-up attacks compared to Jingyuan and Himeko. So she's kind of like the best of both worlds in terms of follow-up attack, right? In a pretty sweet spot. But unfortunately, the only downside for Kafka is that her multipliers for this particular follow-up attack is really low, at only 140%, and DOTs do not benefit from the Proof of That, right? Because they are not considered as a follow-up attack. So generally speaking, Kafka acts more like a support for Nambi rather than an actual main DPS to be paired up with Topaz, right? She's still really synergistic because all of her abilities are AoE, right? She can use a skill and ultimate to just clear the mobs, and the follow-up attack can greatly increase Nambi's action value for Topaz to just deal tremendous amounts of damage. So it is definitely something to keep in mind. Also, one last thing is that Kafka needs really good relics to actually pull this off, instead of just using her in a standard DOT team composition, because not only do you need speed, you also want attack as well as crit rate and crit damage, because your follow-up attacks, the initial damage is the only portion that gets the benefit from Proof of That. So if you're not running a crit Kafka, you're running a DOT Kafka, then the damage is going to be really suboptimal as compared to a DOT comp. At the end of the day, Kafka is definitely a very interesting pick, and I have personally used it myself. Even in full auto, it performs really decently, but she still ultimately performs better as a DOT hyper carry, being a foundation for all DOT team compositions going forward in the future when we have more DOT units, even though they have a pretty interesting synergy together, right? Now we've come to pretty much one of our last sessions, which is the DPS simulations. There is a lack of Himeko, Kafka, and hypercarry simulations, and keep in mind that Topaz simulations, they are very hard to obtain and they're pretty inconsistent due to the RNG factor of Proof of That as well as Nambi on full auto, right? So do take all these simulations below with a grain of salt. So first of all, you can see over here with Topaz, Jingyuan, and Clara. So we just ran like a 3-man follow-up attack comp, and honestly it's not that bad at 786,000 in 4 cycles, which is only 6% lesser than the standard Clara plus Topaz plus Asta comp. So Clara plus Asta plus Topaz, that's gonna be our highest possible damage output for all follow-up attack comps at 837,000, right? So this triple 3-man follow-up attack is actually only 6% lower than our 837,000, which is pretty interesting to see. And if you compare this with like Topaz, Jingyuan, and Tingyun, right, without running Asta, you can see that the damage falls off even harder. It's actually really bad because Tingyun only can buff a single one of them. So if Tingyun buffs Topaz, the damage output is going to be 669,000, which is 20% lower than Clara comp. And then if Tingyun buffs Jingyuan, so Topaz gets absolutely no buffs, then the damage is going to be 689,000, which is around 3% better than the previous scenario. Unfortunately, this time CN didn't theorycraft the damage output for Topaz, Jingyuan, and Asta, but I'm pretty certain that Topaz, Jingyuan, and Asta will have a much better damage output compared to using Tingyun, since Tingyun is a single target support, right? So this is generally it for the DPS simulations. Once again, do take this with a massive grain of salt. With that, we have finally come to our summary. Topaz has prospective future investment value once we get access to better follow-up attack rosters, be it relics, units, or even content like bars from Simulated Universe, the Elation Path, right? Currently, Topaz needs follow-up attackers with high frequency like Clara and high damage like Jingyuan. And as of right now, our current follow-up attack roster really only has Clara as our best in slot, while our main DPS Topaz, although she's definitely viable, you can run her as a main DPS with absolutely no issues, it will definitely not output as much damage as other traditional hyper carries like Jingliu, Imbibitor Lune, Sile, and all this kind of stuff, right? She's definitely not to the point where she's really bad, and players can freely pull and invest in her if players just want to use Topaz. So the two comps, the best for hyper carry is going to be Bronya and Tingyun, and then the best for follow-up attack is going to be Asta and Clara, right? So at the end of the day, experiment this with yourself because theory can only go so far. And with that, we've come to the end of Topaz CN team compositions. Let me know in the comments what kind of team compositions are you guys running with Topaz. Maybe it's something that nobody even discovered yet, so that's going to be very interesting, right? If you guys would like to engage in further discussions, feel free to check out my Discord, Pokke's Village, where we have a very active community talking about Honkai Star Rail on a daily basis. If you guys would like to check out my stream, that's going to be twitch.tv/MrPokke, and I stream 3 times a week. Schedule will be updated on Discord as well. So with that, that's all I have for today. All the best for Topaz pools if you guys still haven't pulled for Topaz, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.